was great meeting with Anna, but I knew the story didn't end there. I decided to meet with Nick Allen at BMPA's headquarters to discuss the UK's supply chains and see what else he could tell me.
Hello.
Hello, it's Bethan Grylls from...
Hi there. If you push against the door.
Perfect. It was a heavy door. I obviously needed to work out more.
So Nick, thank you for joining me today on my sort of journey to understand a bit more about food insecurity. I thought it would be a good place to start to ask you, what do you believe, what role should the industry be playing in food security?
Well, I think the first thing we need to decide is what do we mean by food security, and this is different from food self-sufficiency. And we can sort of talk about that as we go on. But if you look at sort of food security in this country, and the definition of food security, it is actually, is there enough food available for people? Is it affordable? Is it providing nutritional content that sort of people sort of want? Those are the three main criteria that certainly United Nations would define as food security. And you would actually say this country is pretty well off from that point of view.
Yeah.
We've probably got the highest level of food availability in the world in this country, and certainly sort of in terms of times, 24/7. If you've got the money and you can afford it, you can actually buy whatever you want, so whenever you want, so you could argue that we've got really good food security. How much of it is produced at home here is a different story, and how much is actually affordable sort of by the public, and whether actually the public are buying and eating the right things, from their own health point of view is slightly sort of different. But you'd have to say an outsider looking at this country would say actually it's pretty secure in terms of food security.
So do you think that self-sufficiency is linked to food security?
It is on a grander scale, and I think the war in Ukraine has actually highlighted some vulnerabilities, really. For a long time, we've gone on and taken the attitude, we're a wealthy nation, we can actually import food from wherever we want in the world, and we can, on the whole, we can afford it. But then the Ukraine war has made everyone think, these things can happen, the unthinkable can happen. We could suddenly find ourselves, with us of, being cut off from our food supplies, and then self-sufficiency does become much more critical. And if you look back before the Second World War, we'd let sort of food self-sufficiency decline tremendously. We're really dependent on imports, and then the war happened and suddenly we couldn't get everything, and then there's a panic and everyone had to start sort of growing things. So I think there's a level that politicians need to decide is, where are they comfortable with the amount of food we're producing at home here, and if the worst happened, would that support this nation? And at the moment we're probably only producing about 60% of our own sort of needs, so if we were sort of cut off for some reason, we would have to move pretty quickly to try and sort of fulfill that extra 40% that we need.
So in terms of the food that we are producing versus the food that we're not, what kind of things are we really good at in Britain at growing and producing?
Well, I think this is a country that's really good at growing grass, and actually we should be able to produce. We should be producing sort of livestock, and sort of focusing on it. It's one of the best things we do, and crops. But obviously, sort of tropical fruit and things like that, we're never going to sort of grow here. We're never going to fulfill those needs. But for instance, we produce more lamb than we need. We actually, about the same amount. We actually export some and we import sort of some. But we're almost sort of self-sufficient in sort of lamb. We're probably about 80% self-sufficient in beef. And probably quite a bit less on pork, so which are the main sort of products that we deal with in this organisation. So we could produce more if the economic sort of climate was right and the encouragement was there for the producers to actually produce more. But that's probably when we sort of get into self-sufficiency and why aren't we producing more? It's probably the reality is it's not profitable. And our farmers are not making enough money to actually, sort of produce enough. And at the moment, we're probably seeing a decline in livestock production in this country, mainly driven by, the lack of profitability. One could talk about actually the pressures of the environment and the changes in government policy, but mainly it's about profitability, really.
So how can we make it more profitable?
Well, I think actually agriculture probably needs quite a massive restructuring. to become sort of profitable, we got to recognise that whilst it's unprofitable, we're still paying some of the highest prices in Europe, if not in the world, for sort of beef, lamb, and pork. And yet, the farmers aren't making money. Now, it's not necessarily a criticism of the farmers. It's possibly the sort of the system. It's our base, our factory floor is very expensive. Land is in short supply in this country, so the price of land is quite expensive. The cost of housing is quite expensive. So that sort of puts pressure on livestock production before you even start on the sort of all the other things that impact on profitability.
Is this an industry problem or is this a government problem? What support has the government been giving us, and has it been sufficient enough?
Well, I think the biggest problems are coming from government at the moment is the lack of direction. There is no leadership whatsoever from government in terms of what the direction of travel ought to be. And if you talk to farmers out there, then I should declare I am a farmer as well as doing this job, and have a lot of sort of farming friends. They're completely lost as to know where we're going in this country, and what do the government want us to do? Where do they want to be? What is the government's target for sort of self-sufficiency in this country? What do they want? So a lot of the new schemes that are coming out with seem to be based around biodiversity, around the environment. There's hardly any mention of sort of food production at all. So is the conclusion that they don't actually want our farmers to produce food? We don't know. And then when you doorstep them into public, the politicians will say, oh yes, of course we want food production, it's very important to us, but there's no signals coming from government, and so there's a lot of confused people out there in the industry.
When you say there's no sort of focus on food production, obviously biodiversity will mean healthier soil, which will mean obviously growing food, so it is linked. But what kind of other focus should they be having?
Well, I think they need to, sort of send a signal that they can go hand in hand. But biodiversity and food production aren't necessarily separate. So they can work sort of really well together. And a lot of farmers know how to do that and sort of do it. But there's very confusing signals out there. And if we go back to the lack of profitability in farming, they're very dependent on the subsidy that they've been getting from government. That's virtually been their sort of profit for quite a few years now. And so if that sort of profit is eroded, then they sort of don't know where to go with this. And therefore, do we chase the grants? And therefore, do we chase more sort of biodiversity, some more hedgerows, more tree planting, and less food production to get that money and that secure that income, which is their main role in life, is to supply an income for their family, and put food on for the table and look after their sort of family themselves. So, so they're making these decisions. And if there's no actual real sort of direction of travel from some government, and this is the amount of food production we want in this country, then where's the signal for them to invest in livestock production and in crop production, in machinery to actually supply that food.
And you mentioned some of the challenges that we've seen, so and let's talk about that B word, Brexit, the impact of that. And obviously you mentioned the war between Russia and Ukraine. How has this been, impacting the sector?
Well, certainly if we start with Brexit, so one of the biggest impacts we've seen is a lot of our members export food as well to Europe. So in fact, part of just about every animal that's produced in this country gets exported, and a lot of that will sort of go through Europe. And the bureaucracy that sort of goes on between us now actually selling something to Europe has put a huge extra cost onto our onto our members. And that's a limitation that eats into their sort of profitability, the money they've got to invest, the money that they can pay sort of farmers. So that's had a sort of massive impact. And I think everyone was sold the story that actually when Brexit happened, there'd be a bonfire of, sort of all the bureaucracy and the red tape. We haven't seen any of that, far from it. Actually, we're probably seeing examples where bureaucracy is increasing since we've left Europe. So when we're left to our own devices, we actually devise more bureaucracy, not less, because the British are very good at bureaucracy. So one of the things we do really well, we invented sort of cricket, and we probably invented traffic wardens. So we've seen we're seeing, if anything, an increase in bureaucracy which is adding cost. And at the same time, we're competing with companies on the continent that are sending things here without the food checks coming into the country, without those restrictions and without those extra costs. So that's been making life quite a bit more so difficult, really. And at the farming end, the signals being to farmers, that they're feeling less secure because they haven't got that safety net of the money that was underwritten by Europe. And it's now dependent on the government, and the government's cutting sort of what they're sort of paying. And it's less clear what they're sort of paying to them. So we're seeing sort of farmers probably cutting their, their production, because they're not sure what's going to happen.
And let's talk about the war as well. How have the commodity shortages impacted us? Is there anything that hasn't been making the headlines that we should be talking about?
I think the three Fs are the things I think everyone sort of impacted. It's fuel, fertilizer, and feed. So if you take feed first, because Ukraine was such a big supplier of world's wheat supplies, we've seen wheat rocket in price. And that of course has really hit the livestock farmers, particularly the more intensive ones, the pig farmers and the poultry farmers, very dependent on cereals to sort of feed the animals. So they've seen massive increases, and that's undermined the profitability. And whilst we don't deal with that sector, if you look at the poultry sector and the egg production, egg production is almost going into decline in this country, and they're getting a shortage of eggs because of the cost of food, and it's just not profitable. Pig farmers equally heavily hit by it. Suddenly half the cost of producing a pig is the feed, and if you suddenly see sort of that feed price rocketing up, then that's hit them so dramatically. So they've been hit hard on the feed front. Then you get fertilizer. I don't think anyone realised just how dependent we were on Russia and Ukraine for our fertilizer. And of course, those prices have rocketed. So within sort of 15 months, we've probably seen, the prices of farmers paying for fertilizer gone from £300 a tonne up to £800 a tonne. And at one stage, it went even higher, up to £1,000 a tonne. That's a mess of pressure on their cost of production, because they're very dependent on that, And then, of course, you've got fuel, which is everyone's dependent on fuel, to run everything. It runs our plants, it runs the farms, it runs the tractors, it runs transport, everything like that. So that's gone up dramatically as well, really. So we've seen cost come through, and we haven't really seen so because of the impact on the consumer. And the fact that we're in a sort of recession and the consumer hasn't got a lot more money to spend, we're not really seeing that being able to recoup that extra cost of production back from the consumer. So farmers, everyone in the supply chain is being really hit by everything that's happened. Now,
do you believe food should be nationalised?
I would sooner nothing was nationalised, really. I'm a marketeer at heart, and a free marketeer. But I don't think it's nationalised, but I do think the government's got should play a much bigger role in deciding what the sort of food policy is. And actually, there's no country in the world leaves food production just the market. It's too important to. So I wouldn't necessarily say it should be nationalised, but I do think actually governments need to recognise that actually it's strategically too important just to walk away from and leave to the market.
Do you think that we'll see some positives coming out of their food strategy, which was obviously born from the Henry Dimbleby report? Obviously, a lot of people were quite disappointed, including Dimbleby himself, at that.
Well, this is where, go back to the confusion I was talking about earlier. Sort of, we had the Dimbleby report, everyone sort of looked at it, gulped a little bit about some of the things in it, but it was well thought out. It was, at least someone had stood back and sort of, given some direction of travel, but that seems to have been binned, it seemed to have disappeared. It doesn't seem to be sort of forming the government sort of policy. And all of a sudden, no one knows. So what is the food policy for this country? And and yet they're pressing on with an agricultural policy and agricultural, reforming the agricultural subsidy system and what farmers are doing, without really sort of saying what their food policy is. it has to come in that order. You have to have a food strategy first. How are you going to feed the nation, and then you decide what your agriculture policy is going to be. We seem to be doing this the other way around at the moment.
Do you think that the two have been segregated and they actually need to be thought out together?
Oh, absolutely, yes, yeah. So then it's yes. There's but you would start with actually where do we want to be in terms of food? What's the state of the nation in terms of food supplies? Where's it coming from? How vulnerable are we? And that therefore dictates what you do with agriculture. That is the logical train of thought.
That's my destination. How do I get there?
That's right. So at the moment they're tinkering, and you have got to call it sort of tinkering with the agricultural sort of what the farmers are doing, and we still don't really know what their plan is in terms of sort of food strategy. So where's it going? What's their aim? How self-sufficient do they want us to be? It's fundamental target that everyone needs to know and understand. Out of that will come the confidence to invest or not invest, depending on what those figures look like. But without those signals from government, this is our plan, and we're really lacking that plan at the moment.
And if you were to be, suddenly Prime Minister, what would you do differently?
A lot of this comes back to education, and it goes right the way through. Is if you go back to sort of what are people how are they eating? I think that's really important. They understand that. But I think the biggest people I'd like to educate is politicians and civil servants, because I think there's a total disconnect between how industry and the supply chain works and the understanding that our civil servants and our politicians have got of that supply chain. They can't really make decisions about what we're doing and how we're doing things if they don't understand it. And what we see on a sort of daily basis is actually a lack of understanding of the food supply chain. So if I had the chance for sort of day, actually, I'd want to put in a sort of a program of education for civil servants and politicians about how the food supply chain works.
Well, hopefully, maybe they'll be watching this and maybe they'll take you up on that.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, I've said for a long time, actually, if we're going to make a success of the post-Brexit era, government and industry need to work really closely together, and we're not really seeing that at the moment. We're still seeing them saying we're just going to make our decisions and tell you how it's going to be. No other good trading nation, the New Zealanders, the Americans, sort of wherever you look in the world, do they actually industry and government work hand in hand and have a really close relationship? And we're a long way from establishing that in this country.
And I think the industry is willing to work with government.
Well, we're certainly trying. One of our roles as an organisation is to actually speak to government, and we're doing it on a daily, almost hourly sort of basis. And a lot of it comes back to actually trying to point out to them, actually, no, if you do that, it's going to have consequences. So we spend a lot of time lobbying, if you like, on behalf of the industry, but mainly it's actually trying to, sort of point out to them, look, this is how the real world works. This is how the supply chain works. And therefore you need to do it this way, not that way. Yes.
So to sort of conclude, do you think that we have a food insecurity problem or a self-sufficiency problem?
I don't believe we have a serious food security problem at this moment in time. Because we're still, despite the recession and things like that, we're still sort of on the whole a wealthy nation. If people can't, if food security is about making sure everyone can afford food, that's more of an issue of actually, are we making sure people have got a decent living wage? Are they earning enough to be able to sort of buy the food we've got? If they've got enough money, they can actually, we haven't got a food security problem. I do believe we've got a sort of a self-sufficiency sort of problem in terms of, we don't know what the plan is. Once we know what the sort of plan is, people work towards it. But there's no doubt about it. We certainly on the meat side and on the ruminant meat side, we're seeing massive sort of people everywhere saying, so cut meat production, and therefore that filters through and everyone's cutting out livestock production. This is one of the best countries in the world to actually produce, livestock in, and we should be utilising that. We grow grass really well here. Ireland and New Zealand are some of the best grass growing nations in the world. So that's what we should be utilising. urbanizing, and we have so much of our land that can only just grow grass. So that's what we should be focusing on. So the debate about what people eat and how they eat and what their diets look like is a separate issue altogether. If we wanted to play our part in the world, we should actually be increasing livestock production in this country, not decreasing it.
Really interesting perspective. Thank you so much, Nick. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me.
Okay, thank you.
Catch episode 3 tomorrow when I speak with pilgrims.